Hey everybody, and welcome back to Unfazed. I'm Lakey.
And I'm Rachel.
And this past week, we have seen the worst attack on Israel since the Holocaust. There have been over 3,200 Israelis injured, over 1,300 Israelis killed. There's 120 confirmed Israeli hostages, and the terrorist organization Hamas has struck 2,687 of its targets, and there have been over 6,000 rockets fired from Gaza. So we have so much to discuss this week. That we're actually going to be dividing this episode up into two parts. This first episode is going to discuss the history of the nation of Israel and just the overall Middle East so that you can fully understand the context around the current conflict, as well as just the overall situation that is the Middle East right now. So with that, we're just going to hop right in.
So we want to just start off with some basic biblical and historical background because I think it's really important to set the scene because a lot of people really just don't know what's going on, where this conflict even started from. And it was something I wasn't really fully aware of until we did a lot of this research, but also Lakey and I both went to Israel and we learned a lot about the history of it there. And so we just want to provide that for you because it's really difficult, especially trying to weed through the propaganda. So,
well, it's like the fact that there has been conflict in the Middle East since pretty much the beginning. Which is why we feel like it's so important to just start with the beginning, which is the Bible.
Yeah. So we're going to start with the Abrahamic Covenant. And so, again, all of this is going to be from a Christian perspective because we are Christians, but also this is just the truth. And so we're going to start with the Abrahamic Covenant. Right. So if you're a Christian, you know what we're talking about. And
maybe you don't, but that's okay.
We're going to explain it. So Genesis 12, 1-3 talks about this. So I'm just going to read the passage. The Lord said to Abram, and God changes his name to Abraham in Genesis 17. So just so you know who I'm talking about, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you, I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
Right. So right there from the beginning, we see the covenant between God and Abraham. The Abrahamic Covenant, where God says, go out from your country, I'm going to take you to a new place, and you're going to have a huge lineage, and great nation's going to come from you. And, you know, it's not only mentioned in Genesis 3, it's mentioned multiple times throughout the book of Genesis, and it's mentioned just throughout the Old Testament. God tells Abraham on a separate occasion that he would have as many descendants as the stars in the sky, and as many descendants as the sand that is on the seashore.
Right, and what's interesting, too, is that Abraham's name was not the only one that was changed. His wife, Sarai, which was later changed to Sarah, she also had a name change too. And so what's interesting is that they were struggling to have children. Sarah...
They were so old, they couldn't have kids.
Right.
Because even though they lived such long periods back then, I mean, sometimes over a couple hundred years. We had one guy, Methuselah, he lived like 900 some years. So, even though they lived that much longer, there was still that biological clock where once you were 100, once you were 90, once you were probably in your 60s max, like you're not having kids. Like women are going through menopause and the men are just there. You're not having kids that old.
Yeah. And so Sarah was getting really frustrated, or Sarai at the time was getting really frustrated with the fact that she wasn't able to provide Abraham a kid. And, you know, God had made this promise to Abraham that he was going to bless them and make, you know, all the families of the earth come from him. And so they were really frustrated, and they didn't have faith that God was going to do that in their old age.
Key.
And so that it really is the key, because in Genesis 16, we see the story of Hagar, who was Sarah's slave. And in that story, it's in Genesis 16 verses 2-4. It says, and Sarai said to Abram, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, an Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, to her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And then later on in Genesis 16:11-12, it says, and the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen.
Right. So right there, they went out of the bonds of God's promise and God's covenant. And, whenever Abraham went to Hagar to conceive a child, because for some reason that's what they thought God meant, and like Rachel said, it's just a lack of faith. Whenever they did that, God said, I'm going to create you a great nation. This just goes to show that sin has consequences.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's not that the consequence of sin was a child, but it's what has come from Ishmael's entire lineage. And even it says here that also shows why there's never going to be peace in the Middle East ever, and in the world, honestly. It says, he shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him.
Right. And, a lot of people try to use like this example to condone things like polygamy and sex outside of marriage and stuff like that. But, God, even though Abraham ultimately blessed God, Abraham was still a sinner. And also the consequences of Abraham's actions here, not the child, but what ended up happening, which we're going to get into in a minute, just goes to show you that like there are still consequences to sin. And if it wasn't sinful, those consequences would not have happened.
Right.
But like you said, because they went outside of God's will and outside of his command, we have all these things that happen.
Right.
So,
and it's also like so many people will say the Bible or God condones polygamy or all these things like Rachel kind of touched on. But really the Bible shows whenever you go outside the bonds of biblical marriage between one man and one woman, bad things happen. An example would be Sodom and Gomorrah. They lived in such sexual immorality. They had multiple partners, same-sex marriages, everything sexually immoral that you could think of. And they literally, their entire towns were burned up.
Right.
Solomon. Solomon had all the wives, all the concubine, and it ultimately caused the downfall of him and his kingdom.
Right. And so what's interesting in this particular situation, you might be wondering, like, what does Ishmael, the son of Abraham and Hagar, have to do with anything? Like, What are you talking about? How sin has consequences and all this stuff. So Ishmael and Hagar ended up getting thrown out by Sarah because she was frustrated and mad, even though she was the one that told Abraham to go in there and do that. Yeah. But God ended up listening to her, Hagar's distress, and was like, I'm gonna make a great nation out of your son. And that ended up happening. So what's interesting is in Islam, Ishmael is one of the ancestors of several Arab tribes. Adnan, who is the ancestor of Muhammad, who is like the most important prophet in the Islamic faith and who is the actual founder of Islam.
Yeah, they believe he's like divinely inspired by Allah.
He's a descendant of Ishmael. And so it kind of starts to open your mind to what's going on. So a lot of people think that Islam is extremely different from Christianity, and it is. But from a historical perspective, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism all have the same roots, just different lineages. So we're starting to see like, okay, this might be why we're seeing these conflicts now, because you had Ishmael's lineage and Isaac's lineage, and God said that he was going to bless Isaac and Abraham through Isaac, not Abraham through Ishmael.
Right.
And so we're starting to see that. And
and I think it's so important to note just the parallels between both sides of the Abrahamic covenant. So the side where, Abraham listened to God and followed God's call with Isaac, and the side where he didn't. So with the Abrahamic covenant, God told Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation. And then he had Isaac. And then through this lineage, you go all the way down to David. God had another covenant with David that said, through your lineage, David, the Messiah will come, the Messiah being Jesus. Then we go and we look at the opposite side of that. We have Abraham and Ishmael. You go through his lineage, and then you have Adnan, who is the ancestor of Muhammad, their greatest prophet. So even through that side of everything and that false teaching, you have the exact same setup of the Bible as well.
Right. And I think that just goes to show you, like, this is clearly something that, I mean, it comes from this screw up with Abraham.
Right.
And I think it's
Ba-bum.
interesting. That's funny. I did not mean that pun, but I'm glad you caught it. But that's why there are so many historical roots between these religions. And so
there is, though, like this main difference. Islam ultimately believes that Muhammad, who's the descendant of Ishmael, and Jesus, that he was this divine, like that both of them were divinely inspired prophets. But, Christianity, we know that Jesus is not a prophet. Jesus is God's son. He is God.
Right. And that is the huge difference too. And the other thing too is, like, clearly, I mean, there's a lot of reasons Islam and Christianity from like an actual theological perspective are different, but like Christianity, God comes down to earth to reconcile us to him. Whereas in Islam and pretty much every other religion, you have to work to actually go to heaven. And so there's a huge difference there too. And like Lakey had just said earlier, this goes to show there's never going to be peace in the Middle East or on earth for that matter, before Christ comes back, because we are still sinners who are going to fight and have conflicts over things like this.
Right. Well, and that's why we know for the end of time, there's never going to be peace in the Jewish and Islamic states. And, taking that a step further, we know that the Christian nation, so every single Christian across the world, there's never going to be true peace in society. And people's always going to try to silence true Christianity.
Yeah, and Matthew 24:6-7 says, "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places." So clearly, until Christ comes back, there is not going to be peace. And we're not saying that like what's going, because I mean the whole thing is that the reason we're doing this episode is because this recent conflict. This attack on Israel, but we're not saying that this is end times. We don't know.
No.
And I would even argue it's probably not, because this is an ongoing conflict. I think people are so quick to assume it's end times because of the conflict, but ultimately, no, there's never going to be permanent peace anywhere on earth, but especially in the Middle East.
Well, and we know that the only time that we're going to see a peace in the world is through the coming of the Antichrist. And that's going to be a false sense of peace. So let me clarify that. That is a false sense of peace. He's going to come into the picture at a time whenever the earth is in turmoil. There's going to be wars happening all over. There's going to be a lot of different like earthquakes and natural disasters that are happening. And he's going to come in. And this is actually found, I'm going to read you Revelation 13:7-8. This says, "Also it." And just keep in mind, it is referring to the beast in Revelation, and the beast is an analogy for the Antichrist. So also it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. And all who dwell on earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. So that is just the story of the Antichrist coming, creating this false sense of peace, but also it uses the word conquer, and everybody's supposed to worship it. So it's not going to be true peace. It's actually going to be hell on earth.
Right. And we know ultimately Christ is the one who brings actual peace once he overcomes the Antichrist in the end and the devil, and casts out unbelievers and the devil into the lake of fire and creates a new heaven and earth. So we know that ultimately Christ is he's the only one who can bring us true peace. And while we're on earth, we're not going to have that until he comes back.
Exactly.
And so like you were saying, there's going to be this false sense of peace. So what like Trump did, for example, with the Abrahamic Accords was great, but we knew ultimately it was going to be temporary, because we're not, again, just to reiterate, there's not going to be peace. No. The Bible makes this clear.
It's definitely easy, though, to have peace whenever the strongest, and peace in air quotes, but to have a way more level international scale whenever America, the strongest nation in the world, is strong. Whenever America becomes weak, because we keep people in line, not just like through military force, but just we are a strong figurehead. We are a world superpower. Whenever we are weak, the rest of the world acts up.
Yeah.
And they think that, like, China is now they're talking about invading Taiwan.
Yeah.
North Korea, when are they going to talk about invading South Korea? Like, there's all these different things that are happening that we would not have seen if America had strong leadership. But even then, the world is still so tumultuous, because think with Donald Trump, the rocket man over in North Korea, our good buddy Kim Jong-un, he was still making threats, testing missiles, like all of these things.
Yeah.
But the difference is Donald Trump did not give money in the Iran nuclear deal, which allows Iran to form nuclear weapons and then give those weapons to terrorist organizations like Hamas.
Right.
But, just going back, to get us back on track here with the Abrahamic Covenant, this was a covenant that God made with Abraham that completely changed the outcome of the world, because it created an amazing, great nation through Isaac, and it created an adversarial nation that is just as numerous through Ishmael. But then that kind of takes us into the historical context and timeline of just, not separating the biblical side of it, but now we're going to get into like what you read in your history books.
Yeah, so we're going to fast forward a little bit, and we'll make biblical references again too. But there was a guy on Twitter. His name is Greg Price, and his Twitter handle is Greg_Price11. He recently posted a thread that pretty concisely explains in general the history of the conflict. And so we've explained the biblical history, but we're going to get into the historical history of the current state. And we added some things too.
We did beef it up a little.
Yeah, because we just wanted to give a more in-depth analysis. Because I really think that, there's a lot of people, and like you was telling me this earlier, there are a lot of people, a lot of well-known conservative commentators who talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict and all this stuff. But I personally have never heard it really, really explained in depth. And so we hope that this is going to be helpful.
Yes.
Because it's really confusing.
It is. And let me tell you, whenever we sat down to start this, I don't think we realized the undertaking that Middle Eastern history was.
Right.
But when I tell you that there is so much literally from the beginning, there's so much literally from the beginning. Like, I don't even know. It was hours upon hours of research. So if you stick with us, I think you're going to be able to leave and understand the actual reason that there are wars and understand Israel's true claim to the land. And it'll be really, really good.
Yeah. So just to start off, so we're going to do it kind of like a timeline. So in 1917, the British government established in Palestine a national home for the Jewish people.
Yeah. And so that kind of goes back to why the Jewish land is not stolen. So we're even going to take this back way further than 1917. So at that point in history, in 1917, the area that is labeled Palestine here was predominantly Arab, and Jews were a small portion of that population. But that's because of the diaspora.
Yeah.
Or the diaspora. Sorry, the diaspora. So the diaspora is basically, it means dispersed, and it means scattered.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so when we say the Jewish diaspora, we're talking about Jewish people who've been scattered all over the country for various different reasons. So that, there's Ashkenazi Jews, there's Sephardic Jews, there's all these different kinds of Jews, and they're all over the world. And so,
and this goes back to the diaspora of this has been over 2,000 years of Jewish people being scattered and displaced from their land.
Right.
So we're going to take you back to 70 AD.
Yeah.
And this is basically, when the Romans took occupation over Judea. And, up until that point, though, of 70 AD, even before that, they had been conquered by the Assyrians, by the Greeks, and they had been constantly in and out of captivity. So they are all different places. I'm sure you remember Nebuchadnezzar. That was in 597 through 586. He kept three distinct groups of Jewish people. He had some that were in Babylon. He had some that were kept in their original place, and then he took some to another area. So that right there is already a dispersion of three different places where Jewish people were. But in AD 70, the Romans took control. And I remember reading about this, and they said that, well, nobody liked the Greek control over the Jewish people. It was nothing compared to the Roman control. Even whenever they had Jewish governors that would rule over their cities, there was the amount of torture and persecution they faced was, I mean, you can't even comprehend it.
Yeah, and so the Assyrians had conquered Israel in 1722, and the Hebrew inhabitants were scattered all over the Middle East. And so that's kind of where, and then Nebuchadnezzar came in. And then after Nebuchadnezzar, there were three distinct groups of Hebrews. There were the group in Babylon, other parts of the Middle East, a group in Judea, and another group in Egypt. And then that's really the beginning of that diaspora. And throughout this period, most Jewish people kept strong ties to their religion, their culture, the
kept
Torah,
that identity.
Right. And so I think that is actually something that speaks to Jewish people in general, because throughout these times where they've been very severely persecuted, they've really held on to their Jewish identity, even like through the Holocaust.
Yeah, and I would even say, I mean, even though Judaism is not the same as Christianity, I do think that it is a God thing for them to keep that intact 100%. But yeah, so we go to AD 70 where they're under that rule, that Roman rule, and the Jews revolted against that because they did not want to be stuck under the persecution that they were stuck under. So you also have to keep in mind too, they're all over now.
Yeah.
So they're revolting, but it's all over, and it does not go well for them. The last few of the revolutionaries end up fleeing to Masada, which me and Rachel actually were there.
We got to go to Masada.
Yeah, it was amazing to see the way that they had built their city in Masada. But the Romans ended up laying siege to it. And everybody, all the Jewish revolutionaries in there they were being starved. They had no access to water.
And what ended up happening was the
Really sad.
Jewish people knew that they were going to die regardless, but they didn't want to die at the hands of the Romans because they didn't want the Romans to have that satisfaction. And so actually in Judaism, it is like if you commit suicide, you are going to hell, like you won't go to heaven. And so they basically drew like numbers essentially, and there were like, they put them into groups. And so by the end of it, what ended up happening was this person would kill one person, then the next person would kill that person until there was one person left. And that last person decided to basically take one for the team and kill themselves so that the rest of them could go to heaven. And which is absolutely, but it's also absolutely tragic. So that's what ended up happening in Masada. And Lakey and I did get to experience that. And that was it was a really cool experience being there, but again, just really, really tragic.
Yeah. Well, and also too, just the thought that to know being captured as well would have been worse for the women and children there.
That was also part of it. They didn't want to have to subject their wives and children to that.
Yeah. So the fact that each man said, okay, I'm just going to kill my wife and child so that way they don't have to suffer under Roman persecution, I think is also a testament to how horrible that persecution was.
Right.
So we get to after AD 73, whenever, the final revolt had been crushed. And Hebrew history would now be the history of the diaspora as the Jews and their world views spread over Africa, Asia, and Europe. So you have all of these Jewish people now spread everywhere, but they had ties to the actual land that is Israel and more for the last millennium.
Right. And, the Romans had destroyed Jerusalem. And so they had annexed Judea as a Roman province. And so they drove, that's why this diaspora had been so scattered out, because they drove them out of Palestine, or it wasn't called Palestine, I don't think at the time,
exactly.
But that area that now is Palestine. So that's exactly what, like you said, like this land the Jewish people had connections and ties to this land well before any of this stuff has gone on.
Right, exactly. So then you fast forward, we get to 1917, and the British government established in Palestine a national home for Jewish people.
Right.
But it's in the very land that has been theirs for the last millennium, historically.
Right. Then you go on to 1937, and the Arabs reject the Peel Commission to create a Jewish and Arab state. So, like, you do want to explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So the Peel Commission took place in 1937, like Rachel just said, and that is basically they were trying to establish two states: the Jewish state, the Arab state,
to create peace. Like, it was the point was to create peace,
right? To give each different group their own territory, so that they could coexist. But ultimately, a local Arab leader, and I'm literally from East Tennessee, so don't hate on me. Anu Bey Abdul Hadi told the Peel Commission that he did not want that, and he actually said that on having Palestine, like as for the Arab state, he said there is no such country as Palestine. Palestine is a term the Zionists invented. There is no Palestine in the Bible. Our country was for centuries part of Syria. So even the most Islamic, Muslim, whatever you can think of is like Palestine's not even real.
Right. And the thing is, too, like the Zionists did not invent Palestine. The word Palestine actually comes from Philistine, which, if you know from a biblical historical perspective, the Philistines were an enemy of the Jewish people. This is actually something that I learned in my time in Israel. And I think that name was very intentional because ultimately this conflict did arise between Israel and Palestine, the Jewish people and Muslims and other people that just hate the Jewish people.
Right.
And it goes back. It goes all the way back to biblical enemies of Israel. So I find that very interesting.
It definitely does. And for anybody who's like, well, I can't think of a Philistine from the Bible, you probably know Goliath. Yeah, he was a Philistine. So yeah, it definitely, it's a biblical name. And once again, it shows you that they've been at war for the entirety of history.
Yeah. And then we're going to go about, I think it's 10 years later. We're in 1947. The Arabs reject the UN partition plan to create a Jewish and Arab state, wage war against the new nation of Israel, and lose more land than the partition even gave them. So this is another attempt after the Peel Commission of creating two separate states to create peaceful coexistence, and the Arabs rejected it again. So we're starting to see this pattern where the Arabs, the Palestinians, whatever you want to call them, are rejecting and refusing. And I think a large part of this is because in Islam, it says you need to go and conquer land in order to convert people for the sake of Allah. And so these people who are very radical Muslims, they're like, okay, well, that's what we've got to do. So they're not going to accept a compromise.
Yeah.
Or at least not for long.
Well, because the compromise goes against their religion. So also to compromise would be them being forced to acknowledge a Jewish state whenever they believe in the annihilation of the Jewish state, because that's exactly what they're taught to do from the youngest age. Me and Rachel just watched a video today about children's networks in Palestine where they have big characters, like people dress up in bumblebee costumes, teaching children to punch Jewish people in the face until they look red like a tomato to become a jihadist, so that their blood, they can have two virgins in heaven. And these are literally kindergartners. And then they asked, well, what do you want to be? One of the kids said that he wanted to be a jihadist, and then the other kid said, I want to be an engineer. And the lady said, well, why do you want to be an engineer? And he said, so I can make bombs to blow up Jewish people. And he was probably 5 years old. Yeah. So this is ingrained in them. And I don't care what a non-Islamic terrorist Muslim says. The Quran teaches to kill all infidels.
Yeah, it does.
And an infidel is anyone who does not believe in the Quran and believe in Allah and Muhammad.
Yeah, I mean, and this rejection of this partition plan launched the annihilation of the Jewish state.
And it went horribly for them because they ended up losing so much more land. Tensions became so much worse. Yeah. But Israel ultimately prevailed in that battle.
Yeah, and then you go fast forward 9 years later, you have 1948, and Israel has gained its independence through fighting a war. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of like this is where Zionism didn't start here, but this is really where it's like really picked up.
It had to pick up there because think about what we're coming off of at 1948. You are just 3 years past World War II.
Yeah, the Holocaust.
So yeah, the Holocaust had happened, and you had all of these Jewish people literally rounded up like cattle. Yeah. They were tortured, mutilated, killed, starved, separated. They needed a nation. They needed to be with people, Jewish people, who had those same experiences, and they needed to fortify a Jewish state because it was so easily taken from them.
Yeah, and just so that, I don't think we explained this, just so that you know, Zionism, we have a definition for you so you know what we're talking about. It's the movement or belief that Jewish people have a historical claim to their homeland. And it's a movement for the reestablishment and now development and protection of a Jewish nation that is now what is now Israel. And it was established as a political organization 1897 under Theodore Herzl, which we actually got to go to his memorial, his grave.
And we put a rock on it. It was very cool because that's what Jewish people do. They leave rocks.
Yeah, and so because so many people had been during the Holocaust, they had been dispersed, or no, that's not the word I'm looking for, but they had been
rounded up and put in concentration camps, and also dispersed because people fled everywhere.
Yeah, they were pushed out of their homes. They didn't have anywhere to go. They didn't have any community anymore, and so it was really important, like he said, so that they could have people who understand them at a time where they had just been brutally.
And we have to remember what we've been talking about. So we went through the entire history of the diaspora. They were everywhere. So Jewish people are scattered everywhere. So they are now settlers in Germany. They're settlers in France. They're settlers in America. They're all over, but they don't have a nation of their own. So, whenever they saw what not having a nation allowed to happen to them, which was being rounded up into concentration camps, and having all those atrocities committed against them, 6 million of them that we know of killed. I think that the need for the Zionist movement, it was more than a want, it was a need. And I think whenever you hear people say that the Zionist movement is wrong or
it's racist, it's apartheid, it's evil, I don't think they truly understand what was going on. And what's interesting is those are the same people who would advocate for displaced populations in other countries to be able to have their homeland back. So it's very contradictory on the left's part.
It is contradictory. Yeah. So there was a need for the Zionist movement. And if somebody says, okay, if you support the Zionist movement, you're racist. No, we just support the Jewish people's right to exist as a nation. Right. Because they've existed as one for a millennium, and they've had that land for a millennium, but it was taken from them, and they were dispersed forcibly by Romans, by Greeks, by Assyrians, by all these different people, but they never lost their shared identity.
Right. And the other thing too is that people think that Israel is this apartheid state, it's just so discriminatory against non-Jewish people. That could not be further from the truth, because Israel, while yes, it's there are a lot of Jewish people there. There's so many Muslims and Christians and atheists and straight people and gay people and all kinds of people that live there and coexist peacefully. So it's this lie and propaganda that's perpetuated in the Western countries that Israel's this evil apartheid state, and that if you're not Jewish or you're not Christian, that you're being oppressed there. It's not true at all. And that in Palestine, it's not Israel doing the oppressing, it's Hamas. Right. But going back to independence, Israel's independence, and we're talking about the modern state of Israel. Mm-hmm. When Israel declared independence on May 14th in 1948, the next day Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria invaded.
Every single one of them.
And it was meant to wipe out the Jews and seemed as a second Holocaust. But Israel ended up winning and then gained more land than they had originally been given by the UN.
Right. Which is also just creates a more volatile space as well. So no countries that Israel ended up beating would sign a peace treaty or acknowledge Israel's right to exist, even after they beat them in war.
Yeah.
So I think this just goes to show too, Jewish people, they've been attacked throughout all of history. And they ultimately, they just feel safest in Israel. And I think we look at what we've seen, from going to Israel ourselves, from visiting the Holocaust Museum, from just experiencing what it's like just living a day-to-day life in Israel, because we were there for 2 weeks, which allows you to really get immersed in a culture. Honestly, 2 weeks. It wasn't a 3-day vacay. It was 14 days. You're going everywhere. You're seeing everything. I went into Palestine. I got to eat lunch there. You want to know what happened whenever I went into Palestine? Anything that we had on our bodies that had the Star of David on, we had to take it off. We all had name tags that had our name and said Experience Israel, Star of David. We were not allowed to take those, wear them. We had people who had Star of David tattooed on their wrist. They had to literally cover up their wrist. They had to find a bracelet and wear over their wrist. And that's because to be Jewish or to support Israel in Palestine would be a death sentence. But Palestinians, on the flip side, were able every day to go through checkpoints, go work and earn money in the nation of Israel. Palestinians are able to go in and out, to and fro, Arabs are allowed to worship. So Muslims can worship there. But what do the Muslims not allow Israelis to do? Worship there on the Temple Mount. Israelis have to literally worship underneath and get as close as they can to their holiest site to be able to worship. But the Arabs do not allow them to. So you have in Israel, the four sectors. You have the Armenian sector, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish sector. But everybody's coexisting.
Yeah.
You're allowed to coexist. It's only whenever you go outside or into the Muslim quarter or into Palestine that you're no longer allowed to be anything other than Arab or Muslim.
Yeah, and I think, again, so much propaganda. Like, because people think that we're the ones that have been fed the propaganda. Like, we've been there. We've seen Israel. She's seen Palestine. I didn't get to do that, unfortunately, but I did get to go to Sderot, which is the town that borders the Gaza Strip. And talk to people there. And unfortunately, they were very heavily bombed and whatnot. But
tell them about the park.
Yeah, so we were in Sderot, and like I said, this is a town that borders the Gaza Strip. So right where all this stuff's happening, we could look over. There's like this lookout, and you can see the Gaza Strip, and like you can see the fence line, you can see the soldiers and stuff. And so they're the first town that usually gets bombed or whatever whenever Hamas decides to strike. And so we had gone and visited this college campus, which I really hope and pray that the people that we met there are safe, and even the ones that we didn't meet. But we ate at this restaurant. It was really nice. But there was this park, and looks like a normal park. There was this big, like, I couldn't
like
tell
a big caterpillar.
It looked like a caterpillar or a dragon or something. I couldn't tell. And you could walk in it, and we didn't realize until somebody told us that was actually a bomb shelter for the kids to run into. So that if Israel got bombed, they could go in there and they would be safe, but also that it's something they could play with, which so tragic. So then you start going around the town, there's bomb shelters like that everywhere, and they're all painted to kind of just blend in, but every apartment has a bomb shelter in it. Every building has a bomb shelter in it. Everything has a bomb shelter. The thing is, where they're at, they have up to like 30 seconds to get into a bomb shelter before they're going to get bombed.
Yeah.
So as soon as they hear that siren go off, they've got to go quickly.
Yeah.
And a lot of them.
Whenever I went, they've changed that. It's 15 seconds.
15 seconds.
From the first siren. So imagine you're on the top floor of your apartment, because everybody lives in apartments over there pretty much. So you're on the top floor of your apartment and you're in a multi-generational home. So you have your 98-year-old mother down to your 15-month-old grandson. And it's your responsibility in 15 seconds to get every single one of those people out of the top floor of your apartment building and down into the bomb shelter. That's impossible.
It's impossible. And the thing is, one takeaway at the time that I had going there was, because everybody was like, how do you not live in fear constantly? And they're like, we just trust that God's going to see us through. And so while I'm not Jewish, I am a Christian, and, it's not everybody there that is Jewish, but, and to go into something that's a different topic, and I'm not going to get super into it, but in the United States, COVID happened, and we acted like we couldn't go anywhere. We had to close church now. We couldn't go to church, but the strip clubs could be open. We just catered and bowed down to this government that and the CDC that was being so tyrannical. And these people are literally on the verge of getting bombed every single day, and they go about their lives because they know that God is going to see them through. That's the kind of faith we need to be having over here.
It
and
does.
So, again, all of this is to say, like, Israel is not what you think it is. Go, if you can, experience it. It's one, amazing to experience it, but two, like, just from a historical perspective, just see what's going on in like geopolitical events. It's not what this propaganda claims it is.
And I just read a person's testimony about how they were raised here, but they were like very much Arab Muslim, and he was taught to be cool with everybody. They were not terrorists by no means. He said they were not terrorists, but they were raised to hate Jews. And he just picked up a book at a bookstore, and I can't for the life of me remember what the name of the book was, but
he was like, I think he was like on the verge of being like going back to Pakistan.
He actually was. He was going to go join the fight. So he actually became radicalized.
He did. And he was like this close to go. He planned on dropping out of college to go back to Pakistan to a terrorist training camp.
Yeah. So then he reads that book and is like, this book is so wrong that I'm going to go to Israel myself and show myself that it's wrong and prove this book wrong. He goes to Israel and realizes that everything he's been taught is a lie.
And like, thank the Lord that
Yeah.
that happened. Like, I think that was a God thing for sure. He said as fate would have it. I would say as God would have it. But, you know, that just goes to show you that like
Propaganda is real.
It is real. And it is very, that's why again, going into a side topic here, when we get so frustrated, so righteously angry about the indoctrination that's happening to our children with the LGBTQ mafia, with, you know, all this different stuff going on with the revisionist history, we get upset and frustrated and angry because that is, I mean, it's maybe not to the extent yet of what's going on in Palestine or whatever other country and with whatever other households, but like, yeah, exactly. And that's the same thing Hitler did. So, to move on, you fast forward in 1967, Israel wins yet another war against its Arab neighbors, conquering Gaza, the West Bank, and Sinai in a defensive war. The Arab League declares the 3 no's, which are no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. Israel voluntarily handed over the control of the Temple Mount, the holiest site in Judaism, back to the Islamic Waqf. I think I said that correctly, and made it illegal for Jews to pray there. And this was in an attempt to create peace. Again, which didn't work.
I think, if anything, it shows that this entire situation just shows that giving up territory to people that hate you is not going to create peace.
Right.
So I hope that they do stop doing that, because now, like I said earlier, they gave control of the Temple Mount back to the Arabs, and now they're not even allowed to go there.
Yeah, so. And I think that quote that Charlie Kirk tweeted out the other day that we were going to talk about is so accurate.
Yeah.
Basically, it says if Hamas stopped fighting, there would be peace. If Israel stopped fighting, it would cease to exist. And so that's where we're at. And that is so true and so powerful. And so with this particular war that they lost, it was the 6-Day War. And it had its origins in disputes between Israel and Egypt over the rights of Israeli shipping to pass through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. And so its troops captured Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, and doubling the territory under the nation's control.
Yeah, and what kind of is different about this 6-Day War, it did create a Palestinian nationalism. So before, you know, back in 1917, the Arab leader, I'm not even going to try to say his name, again, he said there is no such thing as Palestine. This is a made-up name. But now this 6-Day War created a Palestinian nationalism to where they want a Palestinian state, and they actually created the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO. This is one of the this is a part of the Palestinian Authority now, which is one part that is controlling the West Bank. But because of that, the PLO all around the world started conducting a lot of different terrorist acts.
Yeah, and like, you know, Egypt was mentioned this. We're about to get into how Egypt plays a role in this because, again, it's not just Israel and Palestine. One thing I learned when I was in Israel is that if Israel weren't there, the entire Middle East would be just utter chaos all the time because all these countries, even though a lot of them are Arab and Muslim, they still fight each other.
Right.
So then you go to 1973, the Yom Kippur War. And so that is a holiday that Jewish people celebrate. It's like their Day of Atonement. And so Egypt and Syria invaded Israel on that holiday. I think that was intentional, obviously.
Because they weren't ready. Which also, do you remember a few years ago whenever the alleged like Israel shooter bomber went on the Muslim holiday and like blew people up?
I think so.
Yeah, and it actually turned out like it was just another Arab who was trying to start conflict between Israelis and Arabs by faking being an Israeli and starting this. But the entire world was up in arms that an Israeli would have the audacity to do this on a holiday.
Well, think this too, because we see this. There are parallels because Israel, the modern state, is actually pretty similar to the United States in the sense of like, you know, the United States is very culturally diverse, and Israel is, but obviously on a smaller scale because it's a much smaller country. Right. But we see this too, like with like the Black Lives Matter stuff. The minute like a white cop is having to kill a black person because they actually committed a crime, the media paints this picture like the black person was innocent. Oh, it was just another innocent black man that was walking down the street and got shot or whatever. But in reality, there was a crime committed. They do the same thing, but then when it happens on the reverse, silent, crickets. And that's exactly what's happened. So I think there are a lot of parallels there too. And under this Yom Kippur War, actually, what's interesting is that Israel won the war, but they suffered like mass casualties. But peace negotiations ensued after that.
Like they still wanted peace because they just want the right to exist. So then we go to 1979. So think the war's been over for a few years now, and these peace negotiations, it finally seems like it's going to pay off. So Israel voluntarily gives the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt, and then Egypt in turn recognizes Israel as a sovereign nation, or as a sovereign state, which is huge.
That is huge. Because Egypt's obviously a huge country and a very important player in this. And even though Egypt isn't even in the same continent, but it's still right there. And so that just goes to show like the peace negotiations did pay off. And giving back the land did do something in that instance. And so now we have this Israel-Egypt thing.
Kind of alliance, which is not the right way to phrase that.
Because there are still conflicts with Egypt.
But they also work together for the simple fact of like the blockade over Palestine. Egypt also does that blockade with Israel because they do not want Palestine, aka Hamas or the PLO, to be bringing in like weapons of mass destruction and a lot more weapons, because just as much as they are a threat to Israel, they can also be a threat to Egypt as well.
Yeah, so I mean, there were benefits to Egypt as well. So fast forward in 1993, Israel recognizes the sovereignty of the Palestinian Authority over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the Oslo Accords. And then I'm going to butcher this name, but Yasser Arafat uses it to support terrorism. So it ended up backfiring. And that's ultimately, again, goes back to what we were talking about just a minute ago. And so this gets confusing because you have to kind of look at it on a map, because you have the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and all of this stuff. The reason this gets so confusing, and we'll probably get into it more in the next episode that we do.
Or just a little bit later.
A little bit later too. But it's confusing who's got control over what, because Egypt and Israel control part of it. Then you have the Palestinian Authority that has some of it, but they're always fighting up against Hamas. So it's very confusing who even controls what. So again, like this whole idea that Israel controls it all is not even true, especially in Palestine, because really it's the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, and Egypt and Israel only control a small portion.
And ultimately Hamas and the Palestinian Authority is also evil. They are all making Palestine and Palestinians live in an open air prison. It's not Israel
doing that. And you'll hear that Israel's making Palestine that way. It's not Israel.
I mean, at the end of the day, this is why any country has sovereign borders. It's so people cannot be sneaking in weapons of mass destruction and be sneaking in weapons or drugs or human trafficking, all these things. So if Hamas and the PLO or the PA would just stop acting like Islamic terrorists, there wouldn't have to be a blockade. They wouldn't have to be dependent on Israel and other countries for fuel, electricity, water, food. And how kind of Israel to provide those things to a nation who teaches their 5-year-old children that before they can graduate kindergarten, they have to pretend to kill Jewish people in a skit, in a play. That to me shows the character of Israel as a country that does want peace. Because also, let's look from the beginning, 1917, to now we're in 1993. Who is constantly accepting partition deals? Who is constantly trying to talk about peace? It is Israel. You don't see Palestine coming to the table. You don't see Egypt coming to the table. You don't see any Iran. None of these countries are coming to the table. The only country coming to the table is Israel. So how can they be at fault when they are the ones actively trying to solve problems?
Right. Well, and again, it goes back to that Charlie Kirk quote. If Hamas stopped fighting, there would be peace. If Israel stopped fighting, it would cease to exist.
Exactly.
And it's so frustrating because these people over in America, in the Western world, have no freaking clue what they're talking about. They get so angry and are all about free Palestine. They have no idea. They could not tell you a lick about it, but they've been taught, and similar indoctrination that these 5-year-old kids in Palestine are being taught, maybe not to the same extreme, that Israel is this evil oppressor. And it goes back to this same decolonization ideology that we see here. We see, okay, the Native Americans, we have to give them their land back and all this stuff. So then where do we go? And all this stuff. It's all about giving the land back to the original people that lived there. Like, none of this makes any sense. But then when it comes to the Jewish people, oh no, they can't have Israel. When it comes to Israel having a claim to historic Israel, no, we don't want that. So again, it's so much propaganda.
And also too, just going back to the parallel that you had made between the situation in Israel and then like whenever a white cop kills a black person or whenever a white cop kills a white person, like the difference in that. Like there are all of these things that are being shown to Israel children, indoctrinating them with certain things. And then like in America, look at what they are being indoctrinated with from a young age, from LGBTQ things, like literally porn is on YouTube Kids. Like, so I feel like, while it's two totally different circumstances, the end goal is the same, which is to destroy Western Judeo-Christian values.
It is, because that's what they ultimately hate. But going back to this 1993, when the situation where Israel recognizes the Palestinian Authority over the West Bank, the Oslo Accords, that's what that was. Much of the deal actually never came to fruition. And neither side would give up their claim to Jerusalem. So I do commend Israel for not doing that.
I know,
because again, too, it's not the fact that it's like they're banning Muslims from going to Israel or to Jerusalem. It's that the Arab world was to conquer and take it away and allow nobody but Muslims to be there.
And also look at the map; it does not make sense for Palestine to have Jerusalem.
And look at it. Like I saw this meme. And it was actually really accurate. It showed in green the Arab world. So like that entire part of the Middle East. Then it showed Israel. And it's like this tiny little chunk. So if Israel really is a colonizing country, they really suck at it.
Yeah. And
that's what it said on
the meme. That's a very good point to make. But so we're going to go from 1993, where Israel recognizes the PA, Oslo Accords fall apart. And then we're going to go to 2000. So here, Israel offers Yasser Arafat recognition of a Palestinian state in all of Gaza and 94% of the West Bank, with East Jerusalem as its capital. So even there, they were going to divide up Jerusalem and give part of it to the Palestinian Authority. But what do you think happened? Arafat said, heck to the nah, and then he launches the second intifada.
Yeah, and that is a major Palestinian uprising in the Israeli-occupied Palestinian territories in Israel, just so that you know what that is. And then again, Israel is constantly compromising, but the Arabs have rejected that completely. And that's just true historically. And then this war could have been settled, but it won't, because the Arabs refused to do it.
Well, because, remember, in the timeline, they established the 3 no's. One of those no's being no compromising. So they're not going to compromise at any sake of the means. They're going to instead teach their children to grow up, to shed their own blood if it means killing one Jew.
Yeah. So fast forward to 2005, just 5 years later, Israel pulls out of the Gaza Strip. It dismantles all of its settlements and forces Jews to leave their homes. And then the Palestinians respond by electing, you guessed it, Hamas, who turns it into a terror state. And so this is where we're really starting to see the terrorism and the anti-Jewish, I mean, it's always been there, but really pick up. And so the purpose of the plan was to improve Israel's security and international status in the absence of peace negotiations with the Palestinians. But Hamas wanted to establish an Islamic state and then never recognized Israel's right to exist.
Yeah. So now it's really important to think about the map. So you have Hamas, who's been elected to the Gaza Strip, and then the West Bank, you have that being controlled by the PLO. So they are also at war, because while the PLO or the PA, they're one and the same, while they are controlling the West Bank and they are radical and they still hate Israel, they're not half as radical as Hamas.
Yeah, like that is, I mean, that truly even is an understatement. It is like, it's hard to describe how radical Hamas is. Mm-hmm. And Hamas's charter actually explicitly calls for the destruction of Israel. So that is the point. If they want to destroy Israel, completely. They want to destroy Jewish people completely because, again, in the Quran, it says we have to convert all infidels. If they don't convert, kill them.
And while you will hear a lot of people say, like, all Palestinian civilians are not Hamas, like, they do not represent all that. That is true. But here's what I will say. And there are innocent civilians, and there are Christian Palestinians over there right now suffering immense persecution. But all that being said, Gallup did a poll in 2022 that asked, Palestinians, like, does Hamas represent you? And over half of their population said that Hamas does not only represent them, but is worthy of representing them, which I think shows you just the indoctrination that is happening.
Right. So really, honestly, be praying for the innocent civilians who don't agree with that, and to the innocent Christians who, like she said, are being heavily persecuted.
I mean, crazy.
And stuff. That's the thing too, is of course, we're praying for the innocent Israelis that have been slaughtered, or their families who have lost people that have been slaughtered, and people who are kidnapped and all this stuff. But we also pray for the innocent people on the other side as well. And even as difficult as it is, we have to pray for
Hamas,
and
their leaders.
And my sister-in-law actually said this. Shout out to the other Rachel Mel. The other day, she was like, I've had that same. I was telling her I have a really hard time because I want vengeance, but I know that vengeance is the Lord's.
Yeah.
But she made the point, if I was a hostage who had been captured, I would be praying that my persecution was worth something. And also, I was thinking from this perspective too, if I was a hostage, I would also be praying for a heart change from the terrorists. So as much as we want justice and vengeance on this earth, one, it's the Lord's, and ultimately there will be justice. But two, you need to be praying. I mean, Saul was killing, he was killing Christians. He was a terrorist. He was a terrorist, and God changed his heart. And so we need to be praying for that as well, as difficult as it is. That's just a side note, but I thought it was a really interesting way to think about it.
That is very interesting. And a book I want to read is called Hamas's Son. So one of the founders of Hamas had a son, and back in 2014 he went on CNN and actually did an interview about his book, but he ended up rejecting Islam, rejecting terrorism, and was saved by the Lord. And he has a great platform to be able to uncover everything that's actually going on over there and share in detail what you're taught as a kindergartner. And, what is the truth that Hamas is really teaching that the Western world wants to keep from you. But just imagine right now, all these Islamic terrorists, because I've been watching so many videos, but watching the ones who are up on a podium saying, kill all Jews. This is the time to annihilate all Jews and Jewish existence, different variations of that. Imagine if that one who is the head were to come to know the Lord and, probably be killed for it. But I wonder how many hearts he could change.
Yeah, so we need to be praying for that, as difficult as it is, because I'm telling you right now, I struggle with it.
Oh, I do too. But also, like you said, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. But to want Hamas to die at the end of the day is to want them to burn in hell. And that's something I've struggled with, which sounds terrible. But, at the end of the day, I don't want anyone to go to hell and have to suffer for an eternity, not just in physical pain, but to know the agony of not being able to be with the Lord. No one should want that. So I think, we have to pray for the innocents as much as we have to pray for those who are the perpetrators.
Yeah, and that's not to discount the absolutely there are no words to describe how horrific crimes these people committed. That's not to discount it, but we still need to be praying for that. So
exactly.
But anyway, going on from 2006 through I can't even speak.
2006 to 2007.
Yes. Tensions boiled between Hamas and the Fatah party in Palestine. And so a civil war ended up erupting, and Hamas controlled the Gaza Strip, and then the Fatah party controlled the West Bank.
Mm-hmm. And just keep in mind too, Gaza since they were elected, 2005, they've not had a single election since.
So there's no democratic anything, but Israel, they're pretty democratic. I mean, they're not the same exact setup as the United States. They have
They're
a parliament,
working.
but I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a very
Yeah.
similar in terms
There's-
of democratic.
There's a lot of stuff going on right now in Israel too, where everybody's trying to say, and I'm not going to even act like I'm an expert, but they're trying to say that Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to steal everything and rule forever. But so whenever I went to Israel, we were taken by a Jewish person, but he's from America, but he like lived in Israel. He's very well versed in everything going on. And he says that what Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to do is to make the country, their judicial system more like America's, which is ultimately for the better.
Yeah.
So once again, it's just all propaganda that the West is showing us.
Yeah. And so what Lakey was saying earlier about that blockade, Egypt and Israel actually imposed a blockade on Gaza to keep Hamas from getting weapons. And that still exists today, which is what Lakey was referring to. And it rendered Gaza completely almost dependent on Israel for basic needs like fuel and water. And then what's interesting, and this is where Iran comes into this again.
This is
Iran has been Hamas's main sponsor. And so that's where they've been getting weapons and teaching them how to build their own weapons out of the water pipes, which is, that was something recently with what's going on now. They've been saying, oh, well, Israel cut off, Palestine's water. No, Hamas took the water pipes out of the ground to build missiles and bombs.
Yes, and in turn, though, Iran has been Hamas's main sponsor. But who has been Iran's main sponsor? Because I think arguably we could say America.
Yeah, I mean, the Iran nuclear deal, who did that? Was that Obama? Do you remember that?
And what probably is Obama, a Muslim? So I think that there are things that are bigger than us working to control these things. But what I'm getting at here is, as America, a Western civilization, democratic republic, lovers of freedom, we have a constitution. We cannot be doing business with and giving money to countries that do not believe in American values. Like, I'm sorry, we should not be doing any trade with China. We should be sanctioning the ham out of Russia. For instance, everybody is so mad that Russia invaded Ukraine. Okay, but we are giving Ukraine bajillions of dollars, which is crazy.
And not to mention, Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in the world.
Yes.
And so is Zelensky.
Yes, who put Zelensky into power? America. But that's neither here nor there. But we're playing both sides of the war because we are literally giving Ukraine billions of dollars while we're also giving Russia so much money for oil. Yeah. So what I'm saying is we cannot be doing business with these countries and giving them money, especially Iran, because they are sponsors of terrorism. Their country is not free.
No.
It's
very oppressive.
Yes, they're funding Hamas. What else are they funding? They're just adversaries.
And your taxpayer dollars are funding it, whether you want it to or not. That's what's so infuriating about it. It's like, we're forced to pay taxes, and then our government, are made up of mostly idiots, goes and Congress is just like, yeah, let's just give money to everybody we can give money to. And so your taxpayer dollars are indirectly funding Hamas.
Yeah.
And it burns me up. Like, I could combust. It makes me so mad. Yeah,
so we're indirectly funding Hamas while during this time period, from 2005 to 2007 to present day, they have spent so much money, stolen so many resources from their people, starved their people, taken the water pipes from their people to prevent them from having water.
Yeah.
What to do? To do what? To build an intricate tunnel system underneath the entire Gaza Strip so that they can hide under nursing homes, schools, hospitals, mosques, just so that, Israel will hopefully not bomb them and kill them.
Which is literally why when you hear this crap about like the last time there were, rockets going back and forth, everybody's like, well, Israel started it. No, that is not true at all. If Hamas, they always talk about Israel, killing innocent civilians. Israel never intends on killing innocent civilians.
Warn them.
In fact, they refuse to send a missile or anything like that over into Palestine unless Palestine or Hamas fires first. So they only defend themselves. And you know what? Israel has the right to self-defense. They have the right to do that. So they can use the IDF to respond. And that's the thing that, again, going back to that Charlie Kirk quote, it's just them trying to defend themselves and fight for their right to exist.
And in this current conflict too, Israel is telling all of Palestinians, flee to the south. But I listened to a phone call today because Hamas is not allowing their people to leave from the north to the south because they want their people to die, because they want Israel to look like monsters on the international scale. But there was a man, and he was like, I'm trapped. They have locked me in my home. They have taken my keys. I cannot get out. Me and my family, we are stuck here. And they're like, who has locked you here? And he said, Hamas, we are going to die. I mean, I have chills thinking about that because Hamas, they do not care.
No.
And, it just shows like their goal is to win, not to win, to destroy Israel no matter the cost. They fire so many rockets, so many missiles, but they miss a huge percent of their targets because their bombs fall on their own people. And whenever their bombs hit other people, they rejoice in that, and then they use that and they say, look what Israel did to our people. But it's what they did.
Yeah.
So this is what the West wants to not show you. And this is why we have super lib, ridiculous colleges like Harvard having 31 student organizations saying that it is Israel's fault what's going on.
And again, this is why like it is so important to not be scared to speak the truth. I mean, people are gonna get mad, but like this is really what's going on, and people need to know. And they fall on, it's just like anything else we talk about, whether it's transgenderism or LGBTQ, anything. Like this is all propaganda. People have fallen to the lies.
Mm-hmm.
Tell them the truth.
Right.
So but like you said, it's all to make Israel look bad. So going to 2008, the year, unfortunately, President Obama was elected, Israel offers, I'm going to butcher the name, Mahmoud Abbas, once again, recognition of a Palestinian state in all of Gaza, 94% of the West Bank, and East Jerusalem as its capital. And they offered to dismantle settlements as well. But once again, the Palestinians reject it. So I don't know how many times Israel has to extend the olive branch. Right. But again, it goes back to the 3 no's. They're not going to negotiate. And then just as a reminder, Abbas is he's the head of the Palestinian Authority. So it partially deals with the West Bank.
But it's a rival to Hamas. But I think that also shows you like the Fatah Party, the Palestinian Authority of West Bank, is still radical because they're not coming to the table with these common sense partition deals.
Right. And so now you have from basically 2010 to 2021, well, really to now, Hamas launches periodic rocket attacks against the state of Israel, and then they build the terror tunnels that Lakey was talking about to kidnap and murder Jews. And then they also use those same people when they hide under the hospitals, the mosques, the elementary schools, as human shields against the IDF, making Israel look horrible when IDF has to respond.
Exactly.
And so
to now, where in 2023 we are at the single worst attack on Israel in history since the Holocaust.
And people think that it's dramatic because people have been saying, oh, it's Israel's 9/11. And people have been saying that's dramatic. But think about 9/11 and how many people died during 9/11. A little over 2,000 people, I believe.
2,997.
Yeah, so almost 3,000. Sorry. That's a ridiculous amount of people. It's awful. Absolutely horrendous. But we have 300 million people in the United States. Israel is tiny.
It is
comparatively.
It's the size of New Jersey.
It is.
Roughly.
And so like it took us like 3 hours to drive from the top to bottom of Israel. So like imagine then having, what was it, 1,200 that we know of so far people killed, and many more that are kidnapped and being raped and tortured. It is far beyond.
Well, and how many more will succumb to their injuries?
Exactly, because there's so many injured too.
And
so
how many more will we find dead?
Yeah, so it's really tragic. And so that's why, though, we wanted to give this overview of, as best we could, of the history of this conflict, because I mean, there's so many more things we could go into because there are so many details, but it's something that I didn't fully understand until, one, I went to Israel, two, I did more research, and then I know that a lot of people just don't know. And so we wanted to give this build up so that we can give a better analysis and a full analysis of what's going on currently with the recent attacks on Israel.
So I think just to wrap it up, let's just do like a quick overview. So this is biblical roots too. So you have God with the Abrahamic Covenant with Abraham that he was going to make a great nation. Abraham did not have enough faith. He ended up having a child out of wedlock with Hagar as well, named Ishmael, who is the father of all these Islamic states. Then he had a child with Sarah, his wife, and his name was Isaac, and he is like the father of all these Israel. And then I think too that was kind of going further into like a major prophecy fulfillment of just Christians in general.
Yeah.
But anyways, it's huge state. And then you see the Jewish diaspora that has taken place, where Jews were removed from land that they had been on for over a millennium, since like 80, 70 was like the final revolt with the Romans.
Yeah.
And then that takes us all the way. We're just going to fast forward all the way to 1947, where they were granted a Palestinian state. And then 1948, Jews, they ended up fighting for their own independence. And they had their country in Israel. And then ever since then, it has been back and forth war, literally the day after they declared their own nation.
All the surrounding countries attacked, invaded.
Yes. And then you keep going and they keep winning and they keep extending peace after peace after peace agreements. And the Arabs
to reject it.
Yes, exactly. And then that takes us down to whenever Israel ultimately relinquishes control, or I guess authority would be the better word, over the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And then in return, they have the PLO or the PA that is leading the West Bank. And then they have Hamas, who is controlling the Gaza Strip. So that is the Gaza Strip. Hamas is a terrorist organization that's launching multiple attacks, horrible attacks, for a long time. And even the PLO, if we remember too, they started launching attacks.
Yeah.
So both of those groups are radical, while Hamas is far more radical. And then that's taken us to the present day attack that happened October 7th, whenever groups of paragliding Hamas soldiers went to a music festival and just started unleashing hell, gunfire, grenades, lighting people on fire at a music festival. So innocent civilians.
Yeah. So, I mean, that really just takes us through the history of Israel and all the conflicts that it's experienced.
The opposition.
And clearly the Middle East has a long history of unrest and war, and it always will, because unfortunately we live in a fallen world. But it's very imperative and important that we have got a grasp on this, because we need to understand this history. And also just to fully understand like what's going on with Hamas today, beheading and burning alive Israeli citizens and even their own, people. So that's all we have for part one of this. We really wanted to just discuss pretty much strictly history with some side analysis.
Right. But just, showing you why it is Jewish land and why there is conflict.
Yeah. So the next episode, we're going to go more into depth, with analysis about the current situation in Israel that's going on as of today.
Yeah. So we'll be talking about what that is, but also I think a big portion of that is going to be, what does that mean for America and the world? Because there's a lot of questions of, is this the start of World War III?
And like, where is our place as America in this conflict?
Right.
So we'll be diving into all of that next time. So we hope that you learned a lot from this episode, because we just, again, think it's so important that we understand this.
Right.
So next time, we hope that you join us for part 2, where we're going to discuss all of these things. Per usual, if you want to, send us an email with suggestions, comments, questions, it's unfacedcommentary@gmail.com. We will link in our descriptions where you can find us on Substack, Spotify, YouTube, whatever you're listening on, X, and Instagram, all of those things. We're going to link that on there. But until next time, live unfazed.
Bye.